My name is Celia Brown, and I'm the board president of Mind Freedom, as well as founder of Surviving Race. We are very fortunate to have Chaku Mathai here. I'm very grateful that he's here to put on this training. I'm just going to read a little bit about him. He's a great friend and colleague. I'm not sure that everybody knows Chaku. So Chaku Mathai, American psychiatric survivor, ex-patient, whose personal experiences with extreme states, suicide attempts, emergency hospitalization, and being diagnosed with a psychiatric and substance use disorders led him and his family to seek and engage alternatives to mental health and substance use treatment systems. He started some of the first peer support meetings when he was 16 years old, and he ever since. In 2000, he was a deputy board member to Judy Chamberlain in the formation of the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, as nominated by David Oakes, and worked with Judy Chamberlain and Mary O'Hagan on the initial rewriting and responses to the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities to eliminate the section supporting forced treatment, including several in-person meetings at the UN that year on behalf of WNUSP. I haven't said it in so long. He has been training on racial equity and engagement strategies and issues since 1996, with a special focus on psychiatric systems, integrating racial equity into rights-based systems transformation efforts, including advanced directives, rights protection and advocacy, employment, education, and community engagement. He currently serves as a board member for the National Association for Rights Protection and Advocacy, NARPA, and as president of Friends of Recovery New York, a statewide advocacy organization representing people in addiction recovery. He works as a project director for the Center for Practice Innovations at Columbia University, supporting a healthy transition SAMHSA grant focused on changing systems and practices through the centering the voice of young people enrolled or graduating from On Track New York programs, a statewide first episode psychosis model. So here you go, Shaku, welcome.
Hey, all right. Thank you. Thanks so much, Celia. It's an honor to be here and be with all of you. Can you hear me okay? How's the sound going on my end?
Good.
Good. Okay. So, and Ron, I want to thank you especially. I mean, Celia talked about advanced directives. You were one of the first people to write about them when the Self-Determination Act was passed, and the opportunity to really ensure our rights at another level there. So, I mean, I was following you and Celia and Darby around like a lost puppy sometimes. I felt like I was so young and needed, wanted to learn from every single one of you. And I've been raised by this movement, and I've been so grateful to be here. So, and as Celia said, as part, to be supported and trusted by David in particular, and his nomination of me with World Network, that's part of the story. This was an opportunity that David saw that I didn't. I mean, I was like, what are you talking about? I just got here. And he said, well, look, we have a racial equity issue, and, we can't address it if you don't come into the room and, and be who you are. Honor your difference, honor your story. And so that's what I did. I had a conversation with him around the table with Leonard Frank and Carl Bach and, Judy Chamberlain and, a number of us, Mary O'Hagan, a few, people just, and I said, look, I don't know if I belong here. And the question became like, is my narrative offer as a person who comes with a cultural, racial background and story that may or may not have fit the one that was showing up at the time in the movement. And where are we in that framework? And so part of that is about creating an anti-racism framework. So I'm happy to bring that up, and I'm going to have to offer some slides here. We're going to do a little bit of an interactive discussion, I'm hoping. I think if I understand correctly, we have access to chat and questions that you can put on the chat. this presentation is being recorded, so I hope it has some great value to you going forward and can be shared as well. I'm looking forward to it. If you do have questions, feel free. I'm going to turn to Celia here and there to check in and see if there are questions that we can answer in the meantime. So let me, before I begin, I'm going to put up my PDF here of the presentation so that we can get started. Let's see if I can get that going. Oh, I think I have the wrong one up.
Chuck, who I remember that picture. Oh my God, from the UN.
Which picture?
I'm in it.
Oh, yeah,
The slide before. Oh my God.
Well,
wow.
Let me, can you see this screen, the land acknowledgement?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Well,
first, I really want to ensure that, I take a moment here. We're each likely participating on the unceded land, especially if you're in the United States, of an indigenous people. For me, where I used to live and work, it was the Lenape homeland in Manhattan. And now I'm back in Rochester in Western New York. So I'm also acknowledging the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, and by honoring the sovereignty of the 6 nations, Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora. So I ask you to join me in acknowledging their people, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. It's important because most of the institutions for which we either work or serve must also acknowledge that they were founded upon exclusions and erasures of many indigenous people. This acknowledgement, in a small way, demonstrates our commitment to begin the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. And, in my own experience, as I'm from, India, born in Kuwait, but South India, Kerala, where my family's from, is an indigenous place where, colonialism occurred. And so the decolonizing our movement is part of this work as well. So here we are, the idea is to, in the response to, of course, to the murder of George Floyd and now Daniel Prude in my own town, Rochester, New York, are not the only reasons, but they're the most recent reasons why we are feeling and must be compelled to create an anti-racism framework in the movement. I hoped, and as David did when he first nominated me, that we would be coming forward together and creating intersections. The movement after George Floyd, as you can see here, even in LA, people came forward and were saying the names of many of us who died by the hands of police. And I think many of our own communities, as we can see, and now in my own town in Rochester, the streets are filled. This is the street, Jefferson Avenue, and McCree, where Daniel Prude was killed. And the community has come forward, and we're doing teach-ins every night where we're gathering together, and we're going into the night. I mean, we start in the daytime, as you can see here, and we're going into the night, and we're still there learning and supporting each other and bringing our ancestral practices of healing and from trauma to our actual protests. We're doing the work as we protest change in our own communities, as the same sidewalks that rejected us are the ones being transformed by us in this process. And I want to say that, whether it's this picture of Rochester City Hall, where we're calling for a number of changes to occur, and in the story of Daniel Prude, it was again one of us, a man who was struggling and killed by police who not only acted neglectfully in the way they restrained him and the way he died, but just the dehumanizing, humiliating way in which he was treated, and the way the body cams finally revealed were a part of it. A second piece of the story, however, that I don't want to ignore is the impact of the response by the police. Our peaceful protests, as you saw, were met and are continuing to be met at times with tear gas, rubber bullets, pepper spray bullets, all by saying just the very presence of our protest, the very presence of our people calling upon this kind of an agitated response by police, by dogs, by military vehicles, by an aggression that seems to really convey a belief that this group of Black and brown, and now including white people in the mix, are intent to harm, that are somehow going to cause a problem, that they were defending the public safety building and with the belief that we were going to harm it. Well, we got them to back off eventually, and we got in front of the public safety building. We didn't harm it. I bring this up because, again, this picture is a picture of in 1964 in the Rochester riots. You see police and young boys watching. This is after the riots, after the civil rights riots that were occurring then, and after the Civil Rights Act was passed, and after the Housing Rights Act was passed, and enter me and my family coming from India to New York City. We were told to go upstate to get to some jobs in Rochester. And what was happening in Rochester in 1968 to 1972 was that Kodak was not hiring any people of color. It was Smugtown. It was the place to go for work, but not if you were Black, brown, or indigenous. It was not the place to be. In fact, after a great deal of advocacy, including the riots, Kodak finally started hiring people of color. But by the time I got there and my family got there, it was with great resentment. We were taking their jobs. We were taking their neighborhoods. And the animosity and aggression towards us was real. I was feeling it. And I think part of my story is very much driven by the loss of safety that I experienced in that process. I, like these boys, watched, wondering, why do they not like me? Why do they hate me? Why is it that people have to come at me and tell me to go back where I came from? The xenophobia and the racism mixed together was something that I just couldn't comprehend. And it got to a point where I started to mistrust even what was happening at school. There was no place that was safe. The bus stops, the sidewalks, the coat rooms, the bathrooms, the classrooms. Pretty soon, the only way for me to deal with it was to fight back and to, protect myself. And the challenges associated with that meant my guard had to be up. The environment of being constantly on guard and about those threats caused me to feel like my own safety was gone, even at home. I wondered what my parents were thinking. Maybe, I used to be soothed by the sound of their voices in Malayalam, and instead, now I wondered if they were talking about getting rid of me. One day, my mom started watching me while I was eating, and I watched her, and I was about 8 years old. I said, oh, she's trying to poison me. And so I realized then she was trying to kill me and didn't want me around anymore. So I flipped the table and threw food and got into fights and would just refuse to connect, to believe that they loved me, even though that's what they were trying to tell me. Voices started to come out. I used drugs to try to cope, but that didn't work. By the time I was 15, I attempted suicide and ended up in the hospital. And my father was trying, and my mom, Indians, we were trying to, the last thing they would do is call 911. And we struggled. I was hearing voices, seeing things they couldn't hear or see, and hearing things they couldn't hear, struggling with thoughts that that I was imposing upon them. And the challenge upon us was really about, what do we really have to turn to? And the system was not it. Our healing practice of Ayurveda called for yoga, called for meditations. They tried these things with me. And, as an Indian, I thought, I'm supposed to do these things, but I hated it. I didn't like what they were trying to do. I didn't trust them. So I felt caught between two worlds. So I share all this with you to move into a conversation about the environment that we faced at that time. The idea that we could be in a community that had, in Rochester in particular, that really drove people of color into specific spaces where they could live, and then there were specific spaces where we could not live. And that redlining of our community, that driving of policy towards seeing us as less than, seeing Black and brown spaces as violent or negative, was the racist framework that we needed to challenge, and we're still challenging to this day. So let me stop there and ask you, I'm going to kind of stop the sharing for a moment and see if there's anybody having a comment, or I couldn't recall. Are people able to speak on this in this conversation, or is this only me speaking? Celia?
We don't have any comments yet. I think people are just listening.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, that's
you
fine. I
know,
just wanted to back up
I'm
on
not
that.
sure.
Yeah, I didn't want to.
Okay.
All right,
Yeah,
thanks.
just go ahead. Go ahead.
All right, great. You know, there is one comment that came through. I see an anonymous attendee. After the Me Too movement, I thought, where is our Me Too movement in response to psychiatric rape? After the BLM rising, I thought Mad Lives Matter too. How can I get over feeling envious as it concerns social movements that are bigger and getting more exposure than our movement, and get to the work at hand? What a great question. I can relate to that in many ways. You know, when I was first going into our movement, I mean, I would go to the NIAPRS conference, which was a statewide advocacy organization in New York, and I would go to this conference. And I remember it was kind of the mid 90s or late 90s, and Pamani Yellowbird was a keynote speaker there, and she's an indigenous native woman from South Dakota, speaking on the a report she created about the Canton Indians asylum there. And you know, the issue that I was going through at that very conference, I was outside smoking a cigarette, pacing up and down, upset because I didn't feel like that conference or anybody there really represented me. I felt like every time I walked into a room, I was the different one. Nobody really got my story. Nobody really understood where I was coming from. It was from a very different orientation that I felt I came from. And Hermione was outside with me, and she actually asked me if I was okay, and I said no, and I launched into the same feeling. I was like, I don't know what's up with this place, and how, you know, these people that every time I walk in a room, I'm seen as different. And she turned to me and said, I don't want to, dismiss what you're saying, but I wanted to ask you, did you ever think that maybe our power is in our difference? When you walk into a room and that different part of you shows up, what are we doing with that opportunity? You get to be here. What are you doing with that privilege of being here? And I remember being really mad at her at the moment. Like, how dare she tell me I have power and privilege? I don't have power and privilege. I'm feeling oppressed right now. I need her to connect with that and understand that. And then she walked away because she had to go do the keynote. And I realized at that moment, I said, wait a second, that was Pamani Yellowbird. Of course, her whole people have been erased. She gets to say that to me, and I need to think about that a little bit. And I did. I realized at that moment that I was dealing with the intersectionality. I didn't use that language at the time, but that's what was happening. I was realizing that, yeah, while I have this personal experience of oppression when it came down to my psychiatric status, my racial status, a number of features going on, I also had tremendous power when it came down to the capacity to be at that conference. I'm a man, as my gender, that, there's aspects of my, I can go to a women's rights rally and reporters will still come to me for a quote. And, it's just amazing how that will happen. And recognizing that is a piece of this. And so in response to that question about when is it our time, this is an example of a movement, the Daniel Prude's story. This is an example of a time where, because of the relationships that I have built through our connection with the Black Lives Matter movement in our own community, through Free the People Rock, through the partnerships and the commitment that I've made by showing up, not for the first time because there was an issue, but because I cared about those relationships. It didn't just start there with the issue, it started with the relationships, so that when it came time for an issue to be turned to about us, I was asked, hey, can you join us? Can you help us with this? Can you be a part of this? And I was honored to be a part of it. And I think that's where we need to begin, thinking about, as a movement, as a psychiatric survivor movement, ex-patient movement, let's identify the partnerships that we've missed. And there are many. I think there are many in our local communities that we haven't shown up for because we've been doing our own thing maybe, but I think we have to start seeing the combined desire, interest in each other's needs. So let me go back to sharing for a minute, see if I can talk about this anti-racism framework a bit, because I'm speaking about a lot of things. My own story, of course, is a piece of this, but I want to move into what we mean by an anti-racism framework. So this comes from Ibram Kendi's work, How to Be an Anti-Racist. You might want to consider that book as something to check out, but essentially what Ibram Kendi purports is that an anti-racism framework is focused on the policies. If you look at every policy in every institution producing or sustaining either racial equity or racial inequity. So what we mean by racial inequity is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. So that's the idea that, let's say, for example, I'm going to be talking about a policy called forced treatment. The majority of people who are forced into treatment are Black and brown, for example, in New York State. I don't know if that, I don't know how that plays out across the country. I haven't looked at that data directly, specifically, but in New York, that's definitely true. And so that, from an inequities perspective, the policy that creates that inequity is a racist policy. So let's think about that. What would be anti-racist policy that moves in the other direction? The idea is that what are the policies that we can explore, examine, and propose and push for that actually moves us towards equity in these areas? So that's the idea. An anti-racism framework is focused on a collection of anti-racist policies. Another thought that I want to emphasize is that there isn't a place to be when we talk about racism and anti-racism. There isn't a neutral place to stand. A lot of people want to be non-racist. I'm not racist. So that whole I'm not racist thing, what it does is it positions us in a way that to stay in support of policies, inadvertently maybe, but in support of policies that are still promoting inequities. And that's what we're asking, and I'm particularly asking us to stop doing. If we focus on the power of these, that these policies create, and we focus on the policies, we're not going to make it about being bad people. I'm not saying there isn't individually mediated racism. There certainly is. But if we keep talking about racist as a pejorative slur, then we're not going to see it as a descriptor of policies that create inequities. And that's what the framework that I'd like us to consider. So in that sense, the basic idea, whether it's for an issue of racism or any other bias, the consistent function of any racist idea and any bigotry more broadly is to manipulate us into seeing people as the problem, seeing us as the issue instead of the policies that ensnare us. Let me stop there. Are there any other questions? Let me see, there's a comment. Many advocates for the mentally ill, I think in quotes, believes that the highest priority to deal with racism in the mental health system is to diversify the workforce. But what difference does it make what color a mental health worker is if they are still treating me under a medical model using force or coercion? I couldn't agree more. I think in many ways, that's the point of that earlier slide, that the question becomes, if we are continuing to enact a policy that creates inequities, that doesn't change when you put a person of color in charge of it. Even in Rochester, we have that challenge. That was the issue, that these were advocates and people that we cared about and supported in their careers, moving into being mayors and chief of police, and yet they found themselves supporting policies, or at best, not taking on anti-racist policies that would challenge police in order to treat us better. In fact, even just supporting the policing of Black and brown communities in a way that continued to extend that stress and trauma, just in and of itself, recognizing that policing has a deleterious, damaging effect in a disproportionate way to Black and brown people. That was the recognition that didn't happen even with people of color in those leadership roles. So yeah, that's where you can get that a little twisted. It's not just about representation, but representation certainly can make a difference if that framework is part of what we're prioritizing. So I hope that addresses some of that question anyway. I think there's a lot to that, and I think we'll keep going. So this is what I was saying earlier. I just wanted to give an example of a way in which, at least in New York, when we pushed back on this issue, and this was something we took on in the mid-2000 era of IOC. What I mean by that is involuntary outpatient commitment. In 1998, a man pushed another woman off the subway and killed her. So his name was Andrew Goldstein, and the woman name was Kendra Webdale, and they called it Kendra's Law. And they also euphemistically called it assisted outpatient treatment. And in that mode, started to justify this policy as a way to get people into care, right? And in the same way, started to justify, and then including in a challenge when we started to say, hey, look, you're putting more people who are African American, Black, and Spanish speaking into forced treatment than anyone else. What's that about? They studied it from the perspective of bias, and then found that, you know what, this overrepresentation under court-ordered outpatient treatment could be seen as unfair, but it kind of depends. Are you just, maybe we're just getting access to treatment and is less restrictive alternative to hospitalization. You know, and they literally justified it to the legislature that way. And so that's what I mean by an example of a racist idea, in that it put the blame on the person. It made it about whether we were accessing the care, that the great care that they had offered, as opposed to recognizing that many people were saying, look, I don't want to be warmed by the fire that you have burning. That's not the right fire. That's not the service or the care or the type of support I'm even asking for. You're not hearing me. You're not seeing me. That's the difference. That's why we can say today that not only was that research on disparities incorrect, that this policy is in fact a racist policy, because it produces the inequities that we are seeing. And that's what we take on. We take that on. If we need policies that are going to engage people, and that means policies that create new services or supports or alternatives that communities want. All right. So, and part of that is not just representation of the mental health workforce, but we're talking about completely different models of support in our communities. And there are, you know, communities in Rochester, for example, and many other cities around the country that have examples of that we want. It's not just a replication of the same care we had before. Any comments about that, Celia, that I got to catch? I'm not catching everything.
Sarah said thank you, that you nailed it.
Oh, yeah? All right, right on. All right, well, you know, there's a lot to say about that, so I can say more, but I'd be taking that, taking this presentation into just that territory. What I want to emphasize about this, and the question that the person posed about just replacing the people in the mental health workforce is important, because, you know, we are always at risk of recreating the same qualities that outraged us in the first place. Even us, every single one of us in this movement. And that's part of what I'm trying to say. We may have even done so. We might have even created a white supremacy framework without even realizing it. I'm telling you that those exist. It makes it very hard to be a part of this movement as a Black and brown person. And you won't know why that's hard until you talk to us about the differences that we experience in trying to engage our movement. All you got to do is look around. You know, when it comes down to who's showing up, why is it that there is fewer Black and brown people and Indigenous people in the psychiatric survivor ex-patient movement? And that's just one of the things that I've had to take on and challenge. And there's a lot of reasons that we have to offer around that. And the way we can get to that is by having these, what I call courageous conversations about race. This came from a man who wrote, Glenn Singleton. The book focused at the time on school achievement. He was interested in breaking that school achievement gap, and he created a lot of literature in this area. I love this framework because married with an anti-racism framework, it allows for us to start having interracial conversations about what we really need from each other. And that's what's so hard about this environment these days. I mean, everything has become so polarized that people can't have conversations about different ideas. And we need to be able to have them in order to be able to address them. So I felt like I needed a way to, even with my own family or my neighbors, with my coworkers and colleagues, with my movement, you know, to have a way to actually stay engaged when conversations became difficult. Let's say I wanted to address a comment that I felt was racist, or let's say I wanted to talk about a policy that I felt was racist, or simply listen to somebody who was having a hard time with an experience they had in you know, a group that I was part of, or maybe I'm part of, you know, facilitating a Hearing Voices Network group, and somebody's not feeling supported or connected in that group? How do I stay engaged with what is being said to me? How do I speak my truth about what's happening to me? How do I go through that process of accepting that discomfort's going to happen? Many of us know about this from our own work in peer support and our own work as activists, that there is no change without that discomfort. We're not necessarily bad at this. I think part of what might be happening is that we may not necessarily stay at the table long enough for the change to occur. So how do we do that so that we can expect and accept non-closure? To know that certain conversations need to be in it for the long haul. And this is one of them. I have so many examples about that I'll get to, I think. But first, I want to just offer the idea that there are conditions of these courageous conversations. One is to accept that race is a factor in my life. For some of us, it's a given. I don't even get to say that it's not. It's just automatically, clearly part of my story and part of my life. For other people, that's got to be something we think about. You need to take some time to think about how. So that's really the question. How do you make sure race is something you consider? And the reason why that's hard to do a lot of times because we know that race is a fiction. It's a construction created for the purpose of power. So if race is a fiction, why talk about it? Well, because racism is a sociological reality. It's a political reality. It's one of the realities we must take on. So while race is a biological fiction, it is still a sociological reality that we have yet to resolve. We need to isolate race and keep it on the table. There are times when it's easier to talk about poverty, or it's easy to talk about homelessness, or it's easy to talk about even another oppression, psychiatric oppression, transphobia, whatever it might be, and not talk about race. And my observation has been that when we isolate race and keep race on the table, every other oppression gets to be talked about too. However, if we focus on any other oppression first, race slides off the table too quickly. I don't know why that is. It may be because it's the most uncomfortable truth that people have yet to face, at least in the United States. I haven't found that experience in every country. I haven't been out to every country. I know that's true for Indians. We have our own embedded anti-Black racism that needs to be addressed as well. So, Mind Freedom is an international movement. So we need to be able to recognize in our own countries where these issues of race, especially European ones, to really address how race has been moved off the table. And bringing it back is incredibly uncomfortable. Part of that is about engaging multiple racial perspectives. When you're doing that, what happens? What happens to me when I'm in an interracial conversation? Am I able to sit with the discomfort of hearing someone else's perspective and story that's driven by their racial perspective, about their race? So for example, one of the hardest conversations I had was with a woman whose father was hurt in the riots of the 60s. That was a big part of her racial story. She had deeply embedded prejudice and racist ideas about Black and brown people based on her experience as a young girl watching her father get hurt in the riots of the 60s in Rochester. She had to talk about that with me in one of those dyad kind of experiences in a training experience that I was offering, and really had a chance to get through it all and actually talk about that whole story, and felt some empathy coming from me about her story, as well as realized that underneath that was the desire to be part of a whole community, that she did not want to be scared and afraid of people. She wanted to be in a different place. Lastly, there's a few other pieces here, keeping us all at the table. There's things that we have to do in order to be able to do that. How do we really, as movement leaders, as activists, we all have really good skills in recognizing when people are leaving. Well, sometimes we don't chase it down enough. And sometimes we need to follow up on that and find out when somebody's left and find out why, and encourage a conversation about coming back into the fold. And sometimes that means changing something about how we've set the table. It's not always about the desire for diversity. I feel like our movement has always had the desire for it right from the beginning. The thing that I've noticed was that it was the very basic habits and daily norms that we had in our the ways of being that made it difficult. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. The other
Um,
thoughts are, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Chaku, there's one question from Sarah Smith. She says, what role can transformative justice, restorative justice, or work dealing with survivors of interpersonal violence contribute to our movement? And how do we borrow this work and tailor it to our movement? That makes sense? That's from Sarah.
Yeah, let me find it again. Can you read that one more time?
Okay, one second. It's in the QA. What role can transformative justice, restorative justice, or work dealing with survivors of interpersonal violence contribute to our movement? And how do we borrow this work and tailor it to our movement?
Yeah, I think the movements of restorative justice, there's a lot of incredible work out there, and part of it is helping each other see the shared liberation and oftentimes the liberation that we both, have in that effort. So, if you haven't heard about restorative justice circles or community healing networks and some of the work that's happened in that space, criminal justice movements, that we have a lot of intersections there. So first of all, just starting to join with people who are in those spaces and talking with each other about where there are commonalities is a big first step. That's been my main thing, is to have partnership conversations about that. I noticed some other comments in the chat as well. Let's see, I think there was one about whether, am I a BLM movement? I'm certainly part of Black Lives Matter movement here. And and said, Celia, I think you answered no, we're a psychiatric survivor movement partnering with BLM movement, right? That's great, thank you. Another comment, who's at the table, who takes up the most space and talk? I'm white and talk too much because I was silenced, but my talking takes oxygen from Black and brown people. Staying present is needed. And that was from Berta. So Berta, I want to thank you for that, because that's actually, my next point is that there's this challenge to decentering whiteness in any community or in any movement, and especially if it was largely organized and led by white communities. And so how to decenter yourselves in that process includes a number of things. Part of it was what you just said, recognizing that there's a need for our voice, that part of our own process of unlearning and unpacking and kind of addressing our own oppression has been to give ourselves voice. That was one of the first tasks of liberation. The second task, however, is just as critical, and that is to actually start to examine the contradictions in our circumstances that are associated with it. And one of those contradictions is that when I speak, as Berta said, I'm taking space from others. And how do I find a way to bring both of those pieces in while bringing my voice and keeping my voice there? Another part of decentering whiteness is recognizing the fragility of white privilege. And a lot of times people don't like the discomfort of that decentering. And so, and there's a lot of ways in which that, and so there's, books like White Fragility, and you can check those out that help with that. But a big piece of this is the lack of positive white identity development. There's a whole set of work around that. Janet Helms is a colleague that's worked in that area. And I think one of the concepts is that, can people experience themselves with a positive white identity and not just a negative white identity, which seems to what people react to when it comes down to a Black Lives Matter movement, and the reaction of, well, what about all lives? Well, the idea is that, yeah, there are roles and ways of being as white community leaders and members that are in direct partnership with those of us who are in Black and brown and indigenous communities. So finding that is what we're looking at there. So I guess, the other question around Sarah's point around borrowing from the movements and the work, I think there's a challenge there that I want to emphasize, and this comes to the decentering point as well, is that there's a need to recognize that when powerful communities borrow, there's a tendency to keep and co-opt and maybe even keep taking credit for. Let me give you an example of that. And that's colonization is a perfect example of that. And, I'm one of those people who, like I said, you know, I was raised with yoga, raised with Ayurveda. It's kind of embedded in my own, you know, experience. Yet, guess what I was being, you know, people were trying to teach me in programs. They were trying to teach me yoga. And I should be grateful, I guess, that they were trying to teach me yoga instead of some other thing. But there was this weird feeling that I had that, wait a second, now you're coming at me with the very thing that was indigenous to my, you know, community. I get that. How come you couldn't see it in me in the first place? How come you couldn't you had to negate my own views and belief systems and then give it back to me? Well, that's what I'm worried about at times, is that we can somehow borrow and keep and then retake and then claim it as our own. And now that community has been erased from their contribution. So that's the main important thing, is to make sure that we're recognizing, crediting, and valuing at a very high level. And even to the point where you feel it might be exaggerated, but it's really important to emphasize the credit and the citing of the work. Now, we were going to do some small group breakouts. It's a different format today. So what I'd like you to do is, on your own, think about this. In this framework, one of the things that we're trying to do is understand more about, in this just first condition that I talked about, is what can I recall about the events and conversations about race, racism, race relations that have impacted me? Have I been in a riot? Have I experienced discrimination? Have I felt hurt by a relationship? Was there a conversation about race that I felt shut down in? Those are all important to recall. Another piece is to answer the question, in what ways does my race impact my own personal life? Maybe you can even answer to what degree does it affect your life. So the first condition of this process is about really establishing a racial context that is personal to you, local to you, immediate to your circumstances, and that one that you can understand. I love hearing those stories from people. I really, you know, that's an opportunity when we can really just spend time listening to each other in our own racial stories. There are so many things that come out of that. I'm going to move on a little bit. Celia, is there any comment or question that you wanted to bring up while I'm at it? If not, that's okay.
Let me just see.
Can I,
Yeah, Ron, please. Yeah.
Okay.
there was one thing that
Go ahead.
was
Is that
one
Ron?
question that can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Was one question that I don't think was answered, and it's from anonymous attendee. Many advocates for the mentally ill believe that the highest priority to deal with racism in the mental health system is to diversify the workforce. But what difference does it make? What difference does color make in a mental health worker if they're still treating me under a medical model using forced coercion? I would just like to add to that. If you look around at the cities where the protests are now, many of them have chiefs of police who are people of color, and the mayors are people of color, but they seem to not be part of change, but of maintaining the status quo. How do we get people in these positions that are really change makers? Same thing with this mental illness question. It doesn't make a person more of a comrade just by the color.
Yeah, maybe you know, Ron, I did speak to it, so let me try to restate it a little bit more, because I actually did speak to our mayor and our chief in that regard. I mean, so just to use that example of the mayors and the chiefs, you know, I was a supporter and of the very people that were in those positions that are being challenged today. And the reason we were supporting them at that time was that they were anti-racist leaders, and they were people that were supporting those anti-racist policies. Somehow there was a shift in that process, as you noted, Ron. And I think that's what I was getting at, is that we are always at risk, each and every one of us, of recreating the same qualities that outraged us in the first place. There's a quote by A.T. Ariadne, a Sri Lankan activist. You know, he basically says, when we try to bring about change, we're first, ridiculed or dismissed and pushed aside, and then eventually oppressed even further. But then comes the most dangerous stage. And then he calls that most dangerous stage when they give us respect. Right? And the reason that is the most dangerous stage for me is exactly what I said, and Ron, just exactly what you said. There's that potential to actually begin to enact or support or look or not take on policies that are racist or oppressive. Keeping that reflection alive is part of what these tasks are here. So Ron, did I speak to that?
Yes, yes, you did. I was just wondering how we go about changing that.
Yeah, so here's the next step. You're a good segue into my tasks here. So this initial work in our efforts, one of those is to support each other to engage in these conversations about race, racism, anti-racism, racial equity. If you don't get into the conversations about them, if you don't engage them, if you don't sustain them, if you don't deepen them, I think there's a tendency for people to think that they've got the corner on it, or think that they've covered it by, like, let's use representation. We definitely want more representation, but representation in and of itself doesn't change the policy. If the only policy we're taking on is representation, that's inadequate. It's not about I don't want to necessarily make it about the person. I want to make it about the inadequate policy shift. The policy shift was really paying attention to whether there are inequities resulting from the system, and there are, right? So that's what we're shifting to and committing to talking about. And we have a lot of work to do in there. I'm not sure we know enough about the inequities that we are either supporting or taking down. Are we dismantling them the way we could? And so that's where the co-analyzing comes into play. We need to come up with a way where we are able to co-analyze these issues. I mean, so let's use the police issue as an example. We're talking about policing, even advocacy organizations like NARPA that I'm a big part of and very happy and honored to be a part of. We ourselves don't, in my opinion, have enough of representation to co-analyze these policies on policing on our own. We can come up with a policy that we might believe, which is, and I feel like we've come up with a good one, and I'm supportive of it, which is that policing, especially mental health responses, should not be happening by police. That's one. And then the other is that it should not be happening without any force or coercion. And so therefore, mental health professionals are more likely and the least likely to be the ones that we want to see in those positions. We want to see people who are going to engage us in non-coercive, non-force-based ways. Now that is a position we've taken in many ways with a few members that are people of color, but I don't think we've done enough work to actually co-analyze that policy with people of color communities like Free the People Rock or Black Lives Matter or Black Agenda Group, or the various groups that we could be turning to together. So as an international movement or a national movement or a local movement, that's the task that we need to be taking on. Another one is to start identifying those anti-racist policies and intersectional conditions that would create equity. So really thinking through, what do we know about what would create equity and what we don't? That's just something I don't want to say I have the answers to. I mentioned the IOC policy as an example of a racist policy. What would be the anti-racist policy that moves in the other direction? Now, how are we doing on time? How much time do I have?
Got about 40 minutes.
All right. So we got a good amount of dialogue that we can have here. So one of the solutions that I wanted to bring up that, we've been talking about, and Celia is a big part of, is this Healing Through Hip Hop team. Celia,
Thank you for that picture. I have it.
So this year is our New York City team. And I bring it up because, one of the things that's happened, hip hop in many ways has run similarly to our movement. The why of hip hop is very similar to the why of our movement. The why of hip hop emerged out of trauma. It emerged out of an experience where people were trying to interpret the experience from the outside about what was actually happening. And hip hop emerged in a way to actually describe what was happening in our own words, in our own strategy. Whether it was dance, whether it was tagging, whether it was the clothes you're wearing, whether it was the music you were listening, whether it was beatboxing, whether it was rapping, whether it was lyrics. There are a lot of different ways in which the culture emerged in order to challenge what the interpretations that were happening about certain people. And it was largely misunderstood. And in many ways, those are the commonalities that we had. We were trying to speak for ourselves and say what was really on our minds about what was happening to us. And that kept getting reinterpreted by those in power. And it would often be interpreted in a way that diminished our understanding or view of what we were saying. And that's kind of what I see happening in hip hop at times. So Celia, I don't know if you want, I wanted to give you a little airtime to talk about that. What did you get out of the Healing Through Hip Hop initiative lately?
Well, it reminds me of my own recovery and me struggling. Because my piece of it when we present is I do the female rappers and how hard it was to be in a world where men were dominating hip hop. And, you know, I love them all that were doing it. But I needed to see someone like myself who might have been struggling, like Queen Latifah, you know, with domestic violence and relationships. The relationships were very difficult then. There was sort of like a kind of like a rape culture. We're not seeing that too much now. We are, but we've addressed it. It wasn't addressed then. And I went through similar situations. But to have someone bring that up like a role model, just like I feel like in the movement, there's many role models in the movement, like Judy Chamberlain and David Oakes and other people, that I could say, hey, I have something to look forward to. I could mirror someone that has a similar experience that I may have, just like in hip hop.
Yeah.
So I think it's powerful. I also think it's very powerful for young people. And just talking to my son, you know, his friends struggle with suicide. They don't have all these services that they can go to, and I'm kind of afraid for them to go to some of them. But they need a way to express themselves, and it is through hip hop. It is through hip hop, and I think Noah on our team talks a lot about that too.
Yeah, and that's it. I mean,
Is that good, Chuck?
I'm sorry, what's that?
No, is that okay?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that the concept here is that, you know, we didn't really know in many ways how we were going to bring these movements together. I mean, so we knew we had a movement that had a perspective about what we were going through that was very different than the way it was being interpreted. So my experience with hearing voices was being interpreted in a certain way by external people who were not hearing them. And they would come up with a various number of pathological perspectives around what was happening to me. In many ways, that was also what happened to people experiencing the Bronx burning in the 70s, right, Celia, as you have expressed often in your own story. I think the reality is that our movements were running parallel to each other and had not intersected and had not, you know, even tried to have the conversation. We were just each doing our own thing. All we wanted to do was bring it together a bit. And that's what happened here. You see leaders in the hip hop movement, you know, Mike Hands, General Steele, Jay Wonder, Bless Roxwell. You know, these are people that are recognized hip hop community leaders, industry leaders, joined with leaders like Celia Brown and Luis Lopez and DJ Kareem there. You know, these are communities joining with our movement to communicate about a couple things. And that doesn't mean we all agree. It just means we're starting to co-analyze again. We're trying to get to that second task of liberation, which is to examine the conditions that we are going through together and coming up with some solutions together. And at that point, you know, maybe they'll, you know, we'll have a movement that actually gets to take on forced treatment a different way, for example, or another idea. Or maybe they'll challenge us to think about the way we organize ourselves in a different way. I mean, you know, I got to tell you, sometimes our conferences, you know, in the early days, I was like, wow, this is, you know, I'm pretty young. I don't think, you know, if I didn't care so as much as I did about the movement, I might have left because it was kind of boring sometimes, all the talking heads that were going on, you know, and, you know, Celia, you know what I mean, but it was hard to talk about that to people at that time. Ron, you too. I mean, I would be glad to listen to you, but I wasn't necessarily identifying with my own experience at times. So how could I bring it to my experience is what we were getting at. All right, so I want to come back to something because we do have some time to address a couple things. One is, let me see here. I'm going to switch to this concept here of, looking at ideas about ourselves. There's I'll tell a quick story. Have you heard the fox and the stork story? It's an Aesop's fable. The idea is that the fox meets the stork and has this incredible idea of, oh, how cool would it be to meet a stork? And the stork thinks how cool it would be to meet a fox. And they invite each other over for dinner. The fox has the stork over for dinner, lays out a plate, and puts the plate down. And the stork, because of her long beak, she can't touch it. So she invites the fox over for dinner, and the fox has to watch while she, because of her long beak, can get into this vase that she has with the fish at the bottom. And her beak can get to the fish, but he can only stand and watch. So here the thought was that they had a desire to not be racist, to be diverse, to be, to bring multicultural views together. But it was really about how they set the table, where they sat and what plates they used, that were ideas that they saw each other as having limitations, not necessarily ways in which they were going to change the table in order to be able to be together. So that's one thing we ought to consider. What are the organizational ways we might have norms that actually are exclusive? How do we find out what kind of things we might do differently in order to, bring people into our movement more effectively? Let me just check the chat. Anything else coming up, Celia, that we want to bring up?
No, I don't see anything in the chat. I'm just wondering if people, want to ask some questions or speak, or
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Does anyone want to speak or say a comment for Chaku?
There's a
I know.
comment.
Are we able to unmute people to speak? That's what I was hoping for, but I didn't.
There's a comment from Al Galves in the chat that, can you see it, Chaku?
Yeah, I see it. There's an association between feeling unworthy and feeling disappointed in one's life and being a racist. So one of the things we have to do is to combat racism is to help people live better lives and feel better about the lives and then about their lives and about themselves. That's a great insight. I would agree that with that it's easier to look outward, in terms of the things that are inadequate, as opposed to really looking at my own struggles and what I might be, my own self-loathing, my own sense of being unworthy. I think that's kind of what I meant, for example, by the positive white identity development, just on one end of it. So we need to have a stronger sense of self in that area and about our own community. Any other thoughts?
One of the things you've made me think about, Chaku, is I remember being in so many policy meetings in the state of New York, and somebody often would say something that was very degrading towards people with some kind of psychiatric issues. And I would react and chastise the person. And I've learned, as I've gotten older and hopefully a little bit wiser, that putting somebody on the spot like that is not helping. And it's hard not to get angry when you see the injustices, but to create communication, you can't do that. I would have done things a lot differently if I knew what I knew now.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm hearing you say is this concept that we talked about earlier was really, how do we have conversations about race or about any kind of oppression in a way that keeps people engaged?
Exactly.
Right? I mean, because that's where the change is. I mean, and that's where we can quickly become get into a turf war or some kind of polarizing tribal identity issue with people, as opposed to really hearing what's underneath their fears and concerns, which goes back to that other comment that mentioned feeling unworthy. So when when I hear someone talking to me about, hey, look, I'm not privileged. I've been on food stamps. I don't get why people keep telling me I'm privileged because I'm white. So I'll be honest, I don't always feel good about having to engage that conversation. I feel like there's, I get tired and exhausted too. Just like Ron, you must have in those situations as well, right? I mean, it gets tiresome defending our dignity at such basic levels, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's easier to lash out and shut it down. And maybe there's time for that. I'm not going to even say that that's not, completely inappropriate. I am going to say, because I flip my share of tables is what I'm trying to get at. All right. So, but there is incredible value in asking somebody the question, can you say more about that? And then something else happens. They start to reveal their own feelings of inadequacy and feelings of powerlessness and feelings of inability and to actually change the circumstances in their life. And what I start to find myself modeling is that next task of liberation, which is that one that I was talking about, helping people really examine the circumstances and conditions they're in and the values that they have and want to uphold in their life. And when they do that, it's just like what I had to do in my own recovery and healing and process, which was the very first conversation I had about power and the lack of power that I felt and the inability to engage the power that I had, And once I started to move in that direction of engaging the power that I had, the feelings of loss of power became more about helping our movement grow and less about helping me grow. You know what I mean? It became something about the we story and not just about the I story. So speaking my truth, I mean, let me give you an example. I mean, I guess I'm trying to, make sure I'm speaking to some of these issues. One of them is like, so for example, my wife is white. And when I married her, I knew I was marrying into a family that may not understand me and my culture very well. We were having a baby, and in our first holiday party, one of the things that happened is a family member, her mom, said something about towel heads, all right, at the dinner table. And man, my fork clashed on the table. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Everybody stopped talking because they could tell it was a very uncomfortable moment. And they knew that I had some big feelings about it because I don't have a poker face. It just was written all over my face that I was hurt. I didn't know what to say, so I got up and went to the bathroom, and these 4 principles came to my mind. How do I stay engaged? This relationship matters to me. These people matter to me. I'm going to be raising a daughter with this family. I'm going to, my wife matters to me. How do I stay at this table? How do I stay engaged? How do I stay in my body at that moment was part of what I was doing. So I was breathing. It probably took 20 minutes in that bathroom before I came out with a sense of understanding and being centered with what I wanted to say. And I said it, but I didn't flip the table. I didn't, like you said, Ron, I didn't lash out at her, right? But I did say, in this family, if my daughter, if not for me, if at least for my daughter, I want to be able to have her raised in a family that helps her see her full value, not a diminished value. And words like that diminish our value, diminish who we are. And I started talking about it. And everybody, of course, had their moment of defensiveness and discomfort and those kinds of things. And I also had to accept that they might not get it right in that very conversation completely, that it was going to take some time. Same thing happened when my neighbor said the N-word. I wasn't going to be able to talk him out of that perspective from the very first conversation, but he could tell by my face that I wasn't feeling it and that I had a problem with that and that we had to talk about it and that I had a different perspective than he did. When someone told me they were voting for a different candidate and that, my vote was going to be a poor one. And, I had to get into all of these different conversations that I think we can model the kind of change we're looking for in that process. And I think many of you have that capacity and privilege to be able to do that. Yeah.
Chaco, we have another question. Okay. There has been a growing trend to pathologize racism as some kind of mental health disorder. Don't you think this is a slippery slope?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's in some ways pathologizing. It might be a helpful. I mean, even Abraham Kendi uses racism and analogy to cancer in terms of just recognizing it as something that can be treated. He wants it to be seen as something that can be done, something you can do something about. That if you acknowledge it and see it, you might actually be able to address it. But that's as far as I'm going to go with that one. I don't think starting to actually pathologize it in real form is going to be all that helpful to us. It just, in many ways, pathologizing, especially as a mental health disorder, is the way for people to say that something can't be done about us. In many ways continues to perpetuate this idea that there's something wrong with us and not the circumstances, systems, and societal conditions that have created these concerns in the first place. Remember, we got to keep the work and the responsibility on the shoulders of community and help people not point the finger back at the people that are actually struggling with the conditions that are resulting from those very issues. And racism is a social determinant. It is exactly an example of a determinant of health, just like unemployment is, just like poverty is, just like violence is, any of those issues, just like even just not being raised around good food or raised around green spaces. These are all factors that affect our health. Does that answer that question to yours, Celia? Does that work?
I think so. It was
Somebody else wants to
anonymous.
answer.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah, let me know if you have a follow-up to that.
Okay.
I want to, if I have a minute, I'll tell another story and ask you to reflect on it. Celia, what do you think? Do you got a minute? Do I have more time?
Ron, how much time does Chaco have?
There's about 20 more minutes left.
Yeah. I mean, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in the absence of some interaction with the group, let me bring up a couple thoughts. One is there's a story about fish that are swimming along in the river. There's two fish are swimming along. A third fish, an older fish, swims by and says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" and swims away. One fish says to the other fish, "What the heck is water?" So there's this understanding of water that the older fish had that the other two fish didn't. Celia, what comes up, for you in that story? Anything?
What comes up for me is that they're looking at water differently. One says there's no water, and one says there is. So that's a little bit of a conflict, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to talk about something you're actually immersed in, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to name it, even. I mean, if if, for example, if racism, culture, all of these aspects of who we are it's how we make meaning out of things. It's how power emerges in our lives. It's hard to call it out and actually address it, because now it makes it look like we're calling out a part of who you are, as opposed to something that's resulting from a condition in the water, And I think that's part of what we might need to ask each other.
That's a really good enough.
Yeah, is that helpful? I lost you there, Celia, but when you come back.
No, it's very helpful. Very helpful.
Ron, what do you think?
I think it's helpful. I truly appreciate you doing this seminar, workshop, whatever we call it. And I'm looking at you, Chaku. I remember when you were a young man coming to all these things, and I'm really impressed with how much you've grown and what you've taken on. And I'm hopefully thinking that you're going to pass on the leadership role and groom other people, which I see you doing. So my request right now is just shifting gear a little bit. Mind Freedom is trying to be a more inclusive, intersectional organization.
Yes.
We're doing, we're trying, and I'd like to know recommendations that you have, what would be helpful.
Yeah, that's great. I'm so excited about it. And if this is part of your kicking off that process, first of all, that's great. I mean, let's keep having these conversations. And I think there's, for me, when an organization and a movement says they want to do more around racial equity, my answers have been pretty basic. One is at the highest level of the organization, at the governance level of the organization, have a plan. Have a plan that's tied to your strategic plan. If you don't have a strategic plan, get one and build one and make that a priority and have racial equity embedded within that plan. It doesn't mean that you've already got it or got the corner on it. It just means that you're going to, within the next year, next 2 years, work on two things. One is internally, what is it that we need to change about ourselves and learn about and build our own consciousness and racial consciousness, whether it's through training or conversations about race or engagement. So I always think that those plans have to have a few things. One is partnership development. If we're not engaged with people of color in any way, if you don't have any partnerships or linkages, there's no way to practice the work. You know what I mean? So like, you got to have a place, you got to have people to work with in order to bump up against the challenge. A lot of times we want to be prepared first and get ready first and be ready. We need to be able to make mistakes too and learn from interactions in the relationship. It's kind of like asking, when we were asking people, when we were saying nothing about us without us, they kept saying, well, we're not ready. Let us get ready first. What do you need to be ready for? Just bring us in and we'll help you. we'll say what needs to be done, right? And that's part of what is there, is that making room at the table. The first question is, what would we need to change in order for this conference or this next meeting or next Zoom meeting to be one that includes more people of color in the process? And if you don't know people of color to ask, that's the first step. The second piece is actually writing down that plan and starting to hold ourselves accountable to it. So if part of that plan means looking at our affiliate memberships and saying we need to have a strategy for engaging new partnerships, we need to take on, maybe those partnerships tell us, you don't deal with any of our issues. Where were you on the issues related to racism? Have you ever joined a coalition and followed a coalition as opposed to always being in the lead? You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. I mean, even when, I appreciated, Ron, when you asked, hey, what can Mind Freedom do in Rochester? At this point, not a whole lot other than listen and watch and learn, right? But at some point, a relationship with Mind Freedom means you're helping us grow a local grassroots community. Now that I'm back, I'm excited to be part of a group. I was talking to George Ebert actually earlier this afternoon saying, hey, George, I want to be able to do this here. Let's figure this out. And, the idea is to build conversations with people, because there is a growing community here that wants to have a more stronger focus on a Mental Patients Liberation Alliance or Psych Survivors Rock or something like that. We want to do something. But Mind Freedom will be a natural partner in that regard, right?
But what about just think about it. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I just came to my mind. What about a Mind Freedom Rochester affiliate?
We're open to it, but again, so I'm also not speaking ahead of Rochester, right? So
yeah, okay.
I'm in the process of going back to, I can't assume that the consciousness raising that I did with people 20 years ago is the same consciousness raising that people want to do right now. It isn't. What's happening on the streets right now are about shifting the way in which policing is done around us. And that is what everybody has on their minds right now. And I guess the issue that I have is I don't see survivors and ex-patients in my own city coming out to address that policing issue.
Yeah.
They're not addressing, it doesn't impact them.
Right. Because I have always said, I think a movement, once we're fully together, we can help change some of these issues that are coming up.
Absolutely.
Because the people in the street don't know about, trauma-informed practices and peer support and everything we have been doing for decades. They don't know. They know what's in the media. They know the person has a mental illness. Okay, so they go to the hospital. So that narrative needs to change too. And I think in conversations that you have and we all have, that's not so. So we have to get out of our family bubble that we're in, that we know each other, and get outside of it. We have the base. Let's get outside and let's educate more people to understand where we're coming from. I think that's that one of the ways to do it,
Well, and I think also not assuming they don't know, because here's what I got to tell you. When I listen, when we go out on the street with people, they are talking about ancestral trauma-informed practices that are about exactly
Oh,
restorative services and restorative circles. And I mean, they want and already have much of what we need for our movements as well. You know what I mean?
okay. Yeah, I know what you mean.
And it's been
But I
powerful.
mean this, yeah.
I mean,
I
but it's
just mean
both
the
ways.
discrimination
I'm
that
not,
people have. I'm just saying the discrimination that people have with people who were, labeled, diagnosed with a
yeah.
mental illness. There's still a lot of stigma out there.
Well,
And I
yeah.
wonder how people feel about that as you're talking to them in the streets. How do they feel about that piece of it,
Well, that's
you
what I'm saying.
know?
So I brought that up in a town hall that we had recently on policing. And I said, how do we, because there was a call on the people were kind of saying we need more mental health professionals and that sort of thing. And I said, how are we going to keep this from being more force and coercion? And one of the leaders, her name is Stanley Martin from Free the People Rock, spoke eloquently about the continuing criminalization and force and coercion and punitive action that the mental health system and the addiction
Oh,
system
great.
creates. And
Okay.
she spoke so powerfully about it. I was so excited, and I knew that she would, because I've known her for years and have been. But she just, for one reason or another, has not been seen as one of us by other people. Many people have told me, Chaku, I have to decide to be whether I'm black or whether I'm a peer.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Wow.
What do you mean by that? They said, well,
Mm,
and I don't even use the word a peer anyway. I mean, I don't identify like that. For me, that's just another euphemism. I prefer to say ex-patient psychiatric survivor now, because that's very clear to people. I mean, my last press conference, when I became CEO, was from patient to president and CEO. People got it. Oh, he was an ex-patient and now he's a CEO of an organization. Now I get it,
right.
right? And
Right.
that was very clear. If I said from peer to president and CEO, nobody would know what that was even talking about, right? But
Yeah.
she really wanted to make sure that whatever she signs up for, and then I don't want to just talk about Ms. Martin. I'm talking about every other leader that has said that, something similar like that to me, is that what they want to bring has to be valued. And if it's a different
Yeah.
perspective, it can't just be sign up for what we believe and you're in. You know what I mean? It
Yeah, I
has
do
to
know
be,
what you mean.
yeah, it
I
has to
do
be
know.
like, tell us what we need to learn too,
We got about 10
Yes.
more minutes, Shaku.
Yeah. Thank you, Ron. I mean, so
Thank you, Chaco.
any other questions or comments yet? I see Berta responding, yes, thank you. Waiting maintains unacceptable status quo. I'm grateful for your message. Making mistakes is practice. Thank you, Berta, for that. Another comment. I mean, I do believe that there's some challenges in organizational development, and Ron, I think, that's where you're trying to go with your conversation about where does Mind Freedom International go, right? So part of that process is coming up with some ways for organizations to participate in, it could be a learning collaborative, it could be a process together where you're literally forming structural racism or anti-racism initiatives together. And what that means is really going out and, having people go out and do things together and come back and share what they're doing. So if even if you have 4 affiliates or 2 affiliates that are wanting to do this, or if you have, 10 affiliates that want to do this, you could come together on some frequency and share how those partnerships are growing. That's just the first, and this is one of the, best things to start with. Have you stopped, just going to your events and started going to somebody else's?
Good
And
point.
being a supporter of other movements in your neighborhood, in your community. And what has that been like to be part of those other movements? So for example, I got a call today asking me to speak to some clergy, to a caucus of clergy people who want to be better at engaging anti-oppression focused movements. And I said, okay, great. And they welcomed me coming from an ex-patient narrative. They didn't say, oh no, we want you to, talk about the expert stuff, I said, how are you engaging people to honor their lived experience and really come forward with who they are, and who they've been and what they're about? What is the role of clergy in that process? I would love to see more of us engaging faith-based communities that way. Maybe there's movements that would grow along those lines. Maybe there's partnerships, and if you're only showing up at their Christmas gospel, service, that's not enough. You need to be able to show up at the events that actually show some frequency or, regular visibility in those relationships.
I think a faith-based is a really good idea. And I think in those, conversations with them, that's when you can talk to them about different kinds of services that they may not have. Because I realize that families that call the police, for their loved one who's in emotional distress, they're asking for help, and that's where you go to. But if there were other alternatives, hey, you can call a friend if it's not a real crisis. Don't be afraid of the person who's hearing voices. It has to be there are arts for it that we're not really using.
Yeah.
Hearing Voices Network. Pat Deegan has a wonderful training that I've been doing last year. I'm not doing it now. To give people tools on how to handle some things I think would be a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. So
resources.
Yep. And I remember, when I got almost $15,000 from a church from their Christmas collection to do an engaging men and boys.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, to do an engaging men and boys of color initiative. The pitch that we made was.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah, and we
I didn't know it was from them. I remember you doing something.
Yeah, we modeled it after Philadelphia's Engaging Men of Color initiative, where they, there's people there are people in the community with incredible talent that are willing to do things. And that was the second thing I was going to say to Ron's question about what we can do organizationally. I can't tell you how many organizations that have come to me and said, like using Celia in New York City, just use our city as an example. We can't find people of color for these positions. I couldn't believe it. I said, "What do you mean you can't?" You're talking about New York City, right? That's the last place we should be struggling with finding people of color. But it gave me an insight into how biased people were about what capability means.
Yes.
Right? It was extraordinary to me how the same, let's use, young black man that I saw brilliance in, the rest of the organization couldn't see the same brilliance. I didn't understand what mirror they were looking through. You know what I mean? Or what lens they were looking through.
Yeah, that's true.
So, and the answer that came back to me all the time was people would say, "Oh, just need to do more leadership development, Chaku." And I said, "No, I don't think so. I think I need to help you do more leadership discovery. You need to discover leadership, not develop."
Excellent point.
Right.
Right.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah.
Chaku, we're just about the end of this time frame, and what I want to thank you, but also I want to tell you that we have the recording made, and we will distribute it as widely as we can.
All right. I hope it's okay. It's not.
I also offer you the invitation to a much larger meeting where we wanted to do this with mostly Mind Freedom people and volunteers and people who were active. So we've had a small number at this, but I'd like to follow this up with spreading the word. And if you're willing to come back and do a follow-up or whatever way you want to bring this through with a larger, probably talking about a couple of hundred people signing up.
Whatever we can do, Ron. I mean, whether it's a small group or large group, the thing that I would recommend next is that we set it up in a way that we can actually interact with each other. Mm-hmm. That's what we need. We need to have more of these courageous conversation frameworks. I can, set you up however you want to do it, but let's come up with some ways we can do some small group breakouts and really have some of these conversations about race, racism, anti-racism, and racial equity. There's a wonderful process for that I think we could do. And of course, have more panels and, conversations together like this, large group. Of course, I'm a member of Mind Freedom. I've been supportive and excited about our movement, and I'm committed to it. My liberation is bound up with yours. That's the idea, right? Just to end on that point, that the Indigenous community, the Aboriginal community in Australia, that's what they said when people said to them, "How can we help?" They said, "Look, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together." And that's what we're doing.
One of my favorite sayings.
That's right.
We'll talk. We'll talk about planning. And I'm glad.
Thanks, everyone.
Back in touch.
Thanks for including me.
Thank you, Chuck, so much. This was so great. I'm so excited. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye, everybody.
Bye.